The snow started as a whisper, just a few flakes, dancing in the air like tiny white ghosts. I watched them from my car. They spun and twirled, landing softly on the windshield. It was pretty at first, a winter wonderland, just like in the movies. But then the whispers turned into a roar. The flakes grew bigger, heavier. They weren't dancing anymore. They were attacking. A thick, white blanket began to cover everything. The road disappeared. The trees on the side of the road looked like blurry, dark shapes. My car was crawling along, the tires slipping on the hidden ice. My knuckles were white from gripping the steering wheel so tightly. The world outside was a swirling vortex of white. My heart started to pound. Thump, thump, thump. It was getting harder to see. The headlights barely cut through the blizzard. They just made the falling snow look like a fuzzy, bright wall. I was in the middle of nowhere. Just me, my little car, and this monster of a storm. The feeling of being alone was cold and sharp, colder than the wind howling outside. Every gust of wind shook my car, making it feel like a tiny toy in a giant's hand. I had to find a safe place. I had to find one, now. The peaceful snow had turned into a terrifying trap, and I was caught right in the middle of it. I leaned forward, squinting, trying to see anything through the blinding white. Was that a light? A faint yellow glow, way up ahead. It was like a tiny star in a sea of darkness. Hope flickered inside me. Maybe it was a house, or a gas station. Anything would be better than being stranded out here. The light seemed to get a little brighter, then flicker, then grow steady, again. It was a beacon in the storm. I aimed my car toward it, driving slower than a walk. My tires crunched on the fresh snow, the only sound besides the screaming wind and the frantic thumping of my own heart. Slowly, so slowly, a shape emerged from the swirling chaos. A low building with a glowing sign. The sign was old, and some of the letters were dark, but I could make out the words, "The Cozy Kettle Cafe." Relief washed over me, so strong it almost made me dizzy. A cafe, a warm place with coffee and people. It was salvation. I carefully pulled into the small, snow-covered parking lot. There were only 2 other cars there, both already buried under a thick layer of white. It looked like they had been there for a long time. I turned off my engine, took a deep breath, and prepared to run through the storm to that warm, yellow light. I pushed the car door open against the wind. It felt like pushing against a solid wall. The cold hit me instantly, a physical slap in the face. It stole my breath away. Snow swirled around my legs, biting at my ankles. I pulled my jacket tight and ran, my feet sinking into the deep snow with every step. The short distance from my car to the cafe door felt like a mile. The wind howled in my ears, a high-pitched scream. Finally, my gloved hand found the cold metal handle of the door. I pulled it open and stumbled inside, a blast of icy wind and snow following me in. The door slammed shut behind me, and suddenly, there was silence. The silence was heavy, almost as heavy as the snow outside. The air inside the cozy kettle was warm, smelling of old coffee and fried food, but it wasn't a cheerful place. It was quiet. Too quiet. A young woman with tired eyes stood behind a long counter. She nodded at me, but didn't smile. The only other people were 2 men. They sat at a small table in the corner, not talking, not even looking at each other. One was a big guy, wearing a thick flannel jacket. He stared into his coffee cup like he was trying to see the future in it. The other man? He was different. The mood in the room was tense, like the moment before a balloon pops. I walked over to the counter, my boots dripping melted snow onto the checkered floor. The sound seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room. "Just coffee, please," I whispered. My voice sounded strange, like it didn't belong to me. The woman behind the counter just nodded again and turned to get a mug. I glanced over at the 2 men. The big guy in the flannel jacket looked nervous. He kept rubbing his hands on his jeans and looking toward the window, at the storm raging outside. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. I wondered what their story was. Why were they sitting together if they weren't going to talk? I took my coffee and found a small booth by the window, as far away from the 2 men as I could get. I wanted to feel safe, but the strange, tense atmosphere in the cafe was doing the opposite. It was making my skin crawl. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug and stared out the window. The snow was a solid wall of white now. There was no way I was going anywhere for a while. I was stuck here. stuck in this weird, silent cafe with two strangers who seemed to be carrying a heavy secret. I took a sip of my coffee. It was bitter. Or maybe that was just the taste of fear in my mouth. From my booth, I couldn't stop looking at the second man, the one who wasn't the big, nervous guy. This man was older. He sat perfectly still, his back straight as a ruler. He wore a thin, dark coat, not nearly warm enough for a night like this. His face was what held my attention. It was pale. Not just a little pale. It was the color of old paper, stretched tight over sharp bones. His skin looked thin and dry, almost translucent, as if you could see the skull beneath it. His eyes were the strangest part. They were wide open, but they didn't seem to be looking at anything. They were a faded, cloudy blue, like frozen ponds. He looked half dead. He never moved, not a single twitch. The big guy next to him fidgeted and sighed and drank his coffee, but the old man was a statue carved from ice and shadow. His hands rested on the table, one on top of the other. They were long and bony, with pale, clean fingernails. He didn't have a drink. He didn't have a plate. He just sat there staring into the empty space in front of him. A shiver went down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Who was this man? He didn't seem real. He looked like a ghost who had wandered in from the storm and decided to sit down for a while. I tried to look away. I really did. I stared into my coffee cup. I looked at the salt and pepper shakers on my table. I watched the tired woman wipe down the counter with a damp rag. But my eyes kept getting pulled back to him. The old man in the dark coat. There was an aura of coldness around him that seemed to push away the warmth of the cafe. The big guy shifted in his seat and muttered something. The old man didn't respond. He didn't even blink. It was like the other guy wasn't even there. It was the creepiest thing I had ever seen. The silence between them was louder than the howling wind. Suddenly, the big guy scraped his chair back. The noise was loud and sharp in the quiet room. I jumped. He stood up, throwing some money onto the table. "Let's go," he grunted. His voice was rough, full of stress. The old man finally moved. It was slow, robotic. He pushed his chair back without a sound and stood up. He was tall and thin, like a skeleton draped in a coat. He followed the big guy toward the door, his movements stiff and strange. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the woman behind the counter. His gaze was fixed straight ahead, on nothing. They walked out the door and were swallowed by the blizzard. The bell on the door jingled as it shut behind them, and then there was that heavy silence again. But this time, it felt different. The tension wasn't gone. It had changed. It was sharper, more focused. The woman behind the counter let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding. I looked at her, and she gave me a small, worried frown before turning away to wash some dishes. I turned my attention back to the window. My booth gave me a perfect view of the parking lot, or at least, what I could see of it, through the swirling snow. I watched for headlights to turn on. I waited to hear the sound of an engine starting. Nothing happened. I could just make out the two cars that were there when I arrived. They were becoming white mounds, disappearing under the relentless snowfall. The two men had walked out into that storm, but they didn't get into their cars. I kept watching, staring. My coffee grew cold in my hands. Where did they go? Maybe one of the cars belonged to both of them. I watched the closer of the two cars, the one the big guy had parked near. No lights, no sound, no dark shapes moving toward it. It just sat there, a silent, snow-covered lump. The cold feeling of dread started to creep back into my stomach. Minutes ticked by. 5, 10. The blizzard raged on, a wild white fury. Still, nothing. The cars remained dark and silent. I leaned closer to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. My breath fogged it up. I wiped it away and looked again. That's when I saw them. Footprints. There were two sets of footprints leading away from the cafe's door, but they didn't go toward the cars. They went past the cars. They led directly toward the dark, thick line of trees at the edge of the parking lot. They walked right into the woods, into the heart of the storm. My heart hammered against my ribs. Why would they do that? Why would anyone walk into the woods during a blizzard, in the middle of the night? It made no sense. It was crazy. It was suicide. The big guy had seemed so nervous, so eager to leave. But he didn't leave. He walked into the dark, frozen forest with that strange, half-dead old man. The footprints were already starting to fade, the wind and snow working to erase them completely. Soon, there would be no proof they were ever there. It would be like they had simply vanished into thin air. A cold knot of fear tightened in my chest. I stayed in my booth for what felt like an hour. Maybe it was. I watched the snow bury the cars, bury the footprints, bury the world. The cafe was my tiny island in a sea of white, but I couldn't stay here forever. The storm seemed to be letting up just a little. The wind wasn't screaming quite as loud. The snow wasn't a solid wall anymore. I could see the trees at the edge of the woods more clearly now. It was time to try and make a run for it. I paid the woman for my coffee. She looked at me with those same tired, worried eyes. "Be careful out there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It sounded more like a warning than a friendly goodbye. The cold was still a shock as I stepped outside. I pulled my collar up around my face and trudged through the deep snow toward my car. It looked like a giant marshmallow. I spent 10 minutes just clearing the snow off the windows and the roof, my fingers going numb inside my gloves. The wind whipped the fine, powdery snow into my face, stinging my eyes. The silence was eerie. The woods were a wall of black, standing silent and watchful. I couldn't shake the image of those two men walking into that darkness. I kept expecting to see them walk back out, but there was nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the pines. Finally, with the car mostly cleared, I slid into the driver's seat. The inside was freezing. I could see my breath in the air. "Come on, come on! Come on!" I muttered, my teeth chattering. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Click. Nothing. Just a single sad little click. My heart sank. I tried again. Click, click, click. The dashboard lights flickered weakly and then died. The engine wouldn't even try to turn over. It was dead. The battery was completely, totally dead. A wave of panic washed over me. I was stranded. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel in frustration. Of all the nights for this to happen, I was stuck in a deserted parking lot in the middle of a blizzard with a dead car. And somewhere out there, in the dark woods just a few feet away, were two men. One of whom looked like a walking corpse. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. Okay, don't panic. I could go back into the cafe. I could call for a tow truck. But then I looked toward the woods again. A flicker of movement. Was that a shadow moving between the trees? Or was it just my imagination playing tricks on me? My eyes were glued to the spot where I thought I saw movement. The edge of the woods was a place of deep shadows and shifting shapes. The wind made the branches of the pines sway and dance, creating illusions of figures stepping out from behind the trunks. I told myself it was just the trees. It had to be. But the fear was a living thing inside me now, cold and sharp. I was trapped. My car was a useless metal box. My only sanctuary was the cafe, but I was frozen in place, staring into the dark, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The silence was broken by a sudden sound. Snap. It was the sound of a twig breaking. It was sharp and clear in the cold night air. It came from the woods. It wasn't the wind. This was a definite sound. The sound of a footstep. I held my breath, listening. My ears strained, trying to hear over the low whistle of the wind. Then I heard it again. Crunch. The sound of a boot on frozen, crusty snow. Someone was walking out there, someone was coming out of the woods. My blood ran cold. My mind screamed at me to move, to get out of the car, to run back to the cafe. But I was paralyzed, a deer caught in headlights that weren't even on. Then, a figure stepped out from behind a thick pine tree. It was him. The old man. The man made of ice. He was alone. He moved slowly, deliberately, his dark coat blending in with the shadows. He started walking across the parking lot. He was coming right for me. I couldn't see his face clearly in the darkness, but I didn't need to. I knew those vacant, frozen eyes were fixed on my car. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers clumsy and numb. I pushed the door open and scrambled out, falling to my knees in the deep snow. I didn't look back. I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, my legs churning through the heavy snow. It was like running in quicksand. Every step was a struggle. The cafe's warm yellow light seemed a million miles away. I could hear the crunching footsteps behind me, steady, unhurried. He wasn't running, he was just walking, but he was getting closer. I could feel it. I risked a glance over my shoulder. He was a tall, dark silhouette against the white snow, moving with that same stiff, unnatural gait. I pushed harder, my lungs burning, a scream trapped in my throat. I reached the door, yanked it open, and threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The woman behind the counter stared at me, her eyes wide with alarm. "Lock the back door," I choked out. "He's coming." She didn't ask who. She just disappeared into the kitchen. I stayed, pressed, against the front door, my ear against the cold wood, listening. The crunching footsteps grew louder, closer. Then they stopped, right outside the door. Silence. My whole body was trembling. I held my breath, waiting for him to pound on the door, waiting for the glass to shatter. But nothing happened. The silence stretched on, thick and terrifying. I imagined him out there, just standing in the snow, his pale, dead eyes fixed on the door. Waiting. Why was he waiting? What did he want? The woman came back from the kitchen, her face pale. "It's locked," she whispered. We stood there together in the silent cafe, two strangers united by fear, listening to the storm, and the even more terrifying silence just outside our flimsy door. The minutes crawled by like wounded animals. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. I was convinced that any sound would bring him crashing through the door. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously peeked through the small glass window in the upper half of the door. At first, I saw nothing but the swirling snow. The parking lot was empty. He was gone. Had he gone back into the woods? Or was he hiding, waiting for me to come out? I scanned the area, my eyes darting back and forth. Then I saw him. He wasn't by the door. He was standing beside the other car, the one that belonged to the big guy. He was just standing there, motionless, a dark statue in the snow. He was looking at the car, or maybe he was looking at the woods beyond it. I watched him for a long time. He didn't move a muscle. It was profoundly creepy. He just stood there as the snow began to collect on his shoulders and the top of his head. It was as if he was slowly turning into a snowman. What was he doing? Was he mourning his friend? Was he waiting for him to come back? The scene was so bizarre, so unnatural, that my fear began to mix with a deep sense of confusion. The night had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't figure out the rules. I just knew I was trapped in it with a man who seemed to be more ghost than human. Suddenly, a new light cut through the darkness. It wasn't the yellow light of the cafe, it was blue and red, flashing lights painting the snow in strobing colors. A police car. It was slowly, carefully making its way into the parking lot. I have never been so happy to see a police car in my entire life. The woman behind the counter ran to the phone. She must have called them. The cruiser pulled up, its headlights illuminating the whole scene. They lit up the old man, who still hadn't moved. He stood by the snow-covered car, a strange, solitary figure caught in the flashing lights. Two police officers got out of their car, their guns drawn. They moved cautiously toward the old man. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them," one of them shouted. His voice was loud and authoritative, cutting through the wind. The old man didn't react. He just stood there, a statue of sorrow. The officers approached him slowly. When they got close, one of them reached out and put a hand on his shoulder. The old man finally turned his head, his movements still slow and stiff. He pointed a long, bony finger. He pointed toward the dark woods. The officers talked to him for a few minutes, though the old man never seemed to say a word. Then, one officer stayed with him, while the other got a powerful flashlight from the car and walked to the edge of the woods. He followed the path the men had taken earlier, his light cutting a bright beam into the darkness. We watched from the cafe window, our breath fogging the glass. The officer disappeared among the trees. The waiting was agonizing. What was he going to find in there? The old man now sat in the back of the police car, the door left open. He just stared out at the snow. After about 15 long minutes, the officer came back out of the woods. He was walking slowly, his head down. He went straight to his partner and said something. We couldn't hear the words, but the look on his face said everything. It was grim, tragic. The other officer looked over at the cafe, then at the snow-covered car, and then back at the woods. He spoke into his radio. Soon, more lights appeared down the road. an ambulance, its siren silent, and another police car. The quiet, snowy night was now a chaos of flashing lights and official activity. The nightmare was finally being seen by others. An officer eventually came into the cafe. He explained everything in a low, somber voice. The big, nervous man had a bad heart. He and his father, the old man, were trying to get to the hospital in the next town. When the blizzard got too bad, they had pulled into the cafe to wait it out. But the man got agitated. He was scared he wouldn't make it. He insisted they had to leave, so they went out into the storm. But before they could even reach their car, he clutched his chest and collapsed. He died right there, in the snow, at the edge of the woods. The old man, his father, was in shock. He couldn't process what had happened. He just stood there, watching over his son's body, unable to move or speak. He didn't come back to the cafe. He didn't call for help. He just stood guard in the freezing cold. When I came out and tried to start my car, he must have thought I was leaving. He walked toward me, probably to try and get help, but in his shocked state, he couldn't form the words. He was just a grieving father, lost in a silent nightmare. He wasn't a monster. He was just a man who had lost everything. The police found him suffering from severe hypothermia. They said he was lucky to be alive. The police helped me get my car started with jumper cables. The battery had died from the extreme cold. As I finally pulled out of the parking lot, the sun was beginning to rise. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray. The storm was over. The world was clean and white and terribly quiet. The flashing lights of the ambulance were still there, a sad reminder of the night's events. I looked at the cafe in my rearview mirror until it disappeared. The cozy kettle that had been my sanctuary had also been the setting for a tragedy. It didn't seem so cozy anymore. The drive home was long and silent. I couldn't get the image of the old man's face out of my head. His pale skin, his frozen blue eyes. I had been so scared of him, but he had been the one living a true horror story. I thought about how quickly things can change, how a peaceful snowfall can turn into a deadly storm. How a stranger you think is a monster is actually a person in terrible pain. That night taught me something. It taught me that winter roads are dangerous, and you should never travel alone if you can help it. But it also taught me that the scariest things are not always what they seem.